sun was setting, Jacob knew that he was between a rock and a hard place. He'd been in these places before, but Jacob in chapter 32 of Genesis met God in the midst of an intense struggle that he was in. I grew up in the state of Iowa. Maybe you know that in Iowa there are lots of different sports, but wrestling reigns in Iowa. And I'm a proud Hawkeye. I was an average wrestler in Iowa, but as I see those wrestlers and even remember my hometown, they did a great job a couple weeks ago in the state tournament, about a week ago in the state tournament. I'm reminded of the many ways in which this image of wrestling, and that resonates for me, wrestling is an image for interacting with God in prayer. I think that's a really helpful image because there's so many different images of prayer, but in this specific story in Genesis chapter 22, Jacob is in a tough spot. He's running, he's kind of double crossed his uncle up north, and he's running away from him, and as he finally breaks free from him, he realizes he's coming back into town to see his brother that he hasn't seen for over 20 years that he double crossed in the first place, and that's why he went and ran to his uncle. At this point, he's got several wives and children and lots of possessions. But in this moment, he's in a crisis, almost like a midlife crisis. But in the midst of this crisis and crushing experience of both running from some of the things he's done and actually running right into a brother that he double-crossed, and he was scared that actually he would die. He's wise in beginning to honor him. So as he's expecting to see Esau, he sends gifts ahead and does all these things in this chapter. And then he divides up his family because he's concerned if they attack one side, at least his other family might be able to live. He's really scared for his life. He sends everything across the river, everything across to where they're going to meet the next day. And then he stays by himself on the other side of the river Jabbok. And there he meets God in a way that he has never met God. He meets God in ways that sometimes we might meet God through wrestling with God. In that stripped place, he actually cried out and began to just be barren before God. Wrestling is an intimate action. Like as you're in there, it's body to body, and it's intense. You're working. I'm never more exhausted than when I'm wrestling in the sport of wrestling. You're just fatigued at the end of even a 6-minute match. They said that he wrestled with God, or wrestled with this person that's standing in the place of God, whatever this is, an angel, the presence of God. Somehow he's wrestling with what he understands as a man at this moment, and he's wrestling with him, and he can't overpower him. But the one that is with him is not overpowering Jacob. My wrestling coach was a great coach, Coach Kirsten. I loved Coach Kirsten. He's one of the best. He's in the Hall of Fame actually for wrestling in high school in Iowa, and he's no longer the head coach there, but for years, for decades, he was. And I remember oftentimes I would be wrestling with Coach Kirsten, and how Coach would do this. Coach has been wrestling for years, like I'm a high school kid, but he always wrestled in such a way that it was just beyond me. Like I would shoot or do a move and he would counter it, but he wanted to keep letting me grow and to become better. So he would counter it, but he wouldn't try to overpower me, but he challenged me, and I had to keep coming and keep coming. I got better and better. God is not playing with us in these times when we feel stripped with wrestling with God. But God is developing in us a knowledge and a sense of intimacy, especially in our crisis moments. Where do we go in those moments that we feel overwhelmed? Maybe you're not there right now, and that's great. And I hope maybe this moment will be a reminder in this story. I would like you to read Genesis chapter 32 and enter into that space and the intensity of that moment. And maybe that's not where you're at, but if you are there right now, or if you remember times being there, I want you to acknowledge and open yourself up to God. I don't know what that was going on necessarily in your life, but I know in Jacob's life, he was overwhelmed. He needed God in a way that he had never really cried out for God in. This is really kind of the first time he's crying out to God. And he taps him. It's a tap out in that moment. He taps out finally, right? He taps him out. And finally, Jacob leaves after wrestling all night with God, ready to endure and face any type of struggle that he was going to face with his brother or anyone else. I wonder today, and when they use the image of wrestling in prayer, I hope it's helpful, because there's times in our lives when God, I think, invites us into wrestling with him in the midst of a really hard situation, things that we feel overwhelmed in or unable to do. But in the midst of that wrestling and working through that with God, we have a resilience and a strength that happens in and through that prepares us for the challenge that is ahead. I want to encourage you to read this in Genesis 32, and I want you to imagine being present there, and then I'd like you to talk to God about things that might be hurdles for you at this season of your life.